Hi. My name is Kassamira. I use she, her pronouns. I am based in Washington, D.C. in the U.S. I am a dreamer and collective imagination practitioner. I have held a role on the Fun Circle for the last couple of years and also have held this dual role of being a practitioner in the community and also in the Fun Circle. So this year I get to be fully a practitioner, which is really exciting. Really grateful to be here with you all today. We are here with Rob Hopkins, and this is a space where we get to time travel for a collective imagination. Thank you all for joining us. I would love, Rob, if you can introduce yourself, let everybody know who you are, what you're up to.
Thank you so much, Cassia. Hi, everybody. I'm Rob. I live down in Totnes in Devon. I see there's somebody else on the call from Totnes in Devon. Nice to see you. I do a lot of work around kind of catalyzing imagination, I guess. So I do a lot of workshops for organizations. I do a lot of public speaking. I will talk about it later, but I'm kind of an artist as well in what little spare time I have, although I've come to sort of see that actually they're all the same thing, but we can talk about that. So, and I just wrote a book called How to Fall in Love with the Future, which came out last year. So a lot of the work that I do is around that. And that's about it, really, I think. I don't know. That'll do for now, I reckon. That'll get us started.
Awesome. Thank you. So I want to share just a little bit about the collective imagination practice community. Thank you for everybody for being here, for being part of the series, Perspectives from the Edge of Practice. Our aim in these events is to energize, inspire, and challenge our existing community and to draw in new people who are interested in learning more about collective imagination practice and how it could be relevant to them. Really grateful for Rob for being here and sharing his collective imagination practice with us. I'm really excited to time travel together, to be able to be immersed in somebody else's collective imagination practice. One of the really great experiences that I had as being part of the Fun Circle was being able to read all of the different applications that came through and just to see the vastness of collective imagination that's been happening across the world. I mean, even just seeing our chat and seeing how many people are coming from all these different spaces and places who are committed to engaging their community in collective imagination really makes my heart smile. It's one thing to like read the projects on the page and sort of get all of the details, and then it's another thing to see them come to life and to be able to talk to people in real time, to be able to see folks making real time connections that I may have seen. I'm like, oh, I like this person's thing, and I see this thing, and I think they would have a great conversation together. And as we have more of these series and conversations and huddles and other um, community engagement practices, it's really cool to see those connections organically come together. Um, so would love to get started with just a little bit of breath and grounding. I can lead us in a little bit of a breath practice, and then we'll move into our time travel practice, led by Rob. So I'm going to invite folks to find a comfortable position in their chair or wherever they might be sitting or laying, and just feeling your feet on the ground, feeling your hips and your sit bones touching whatever surface that you're on. And I invite you to just breathe, breathing in through your nose, letting it out through your mouth, and just arriving in this space. Taking a moment to call yourself into this Zoom space together with us, knowing that we probably have lots of to-do lists and responsibilities and meetings and caregiving responsibilities. And in this moment, we're exactly where we need to be with each other, Taking another deep inhale through your nose, and letting it out with a sigh. And just feeling yourself be present in this moment. We'll take one more inhale through our nose. And this time with your exhale, see if you can let out any stress or tension that you might be holding in your body. We often hold stress in our shoulders or in between our eyebrows or in our hips. So we'll take an inhale together and exhale and release. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes and come back into this space with us. Thank you. All right, Rob. So we're going to time travel today. And I'm super, super excited. As a fellow dreamer who loves being in different types of time and space, really being able to move outside of our linear ways of thinking. I'm really, really excited to get into this practice with you. So I'm going to turn it over to you and allow you to take it away.
Wonderful. Well, hi everybody, and yes, I live in a small town in the southwest of England called Totnes, and you may have heard of it. It's where the transition town movement started nearly 20 years ago now, and it's also where the first vegetable box scheme in the country started. For what that's worth, but what you probably don't know about Totnes is that deep underneath Totnes Castle, if you can find the right stone to push in the wall to open up the stairs down, is our secret laboratory where we've been working hard for about a device that allows us to travel through time. And in 2016, we established theoretically how you could do it, and we won the very prestigious Schnitzel-Gruber Prize for Scientific Advancement in 2016. And then we went back into the lab to figure out how we might actually send human beings forward through time. And I had the great honor to be part of that initial first manned expedition into the future. And the reason that we do this is, for me, my work I see as being largely around longing and around the cultivation of longing. You know, we are living in a time where we need to see an emergency level response to the climate ecological emergency that the world is facing and seeing accelerating right now. And our theory is that actually just presenting people with evidence and science and numbers is not enough to get us to where we need to get to. And so maybe actually another way of thinking about it is, how do we cultivate longing for what the future would be like if we did everything we could have possibly done? Don DeLillo, the novelist, in his book Underworld, said, longing on a large scale is what makes history. And what has underpinned my work for the last 5-6 years has been, how do you cultivate longing at scale? And so our theory has been, actually, if we can create a device that allows us to take people from the present 10 years forward into the future that was the result of us doing absolutely everything we could have possibly done. And there are many, many other futures. And believe me, we've been to see quite a lot of them, and you don't want to go there. But the one that resulted from us doing everything we could have possibly done is so extraordinary and delicious and thrilling that that's why we've built this technology. And we use it to take other people forward. We take trips there to collect photographs and evidence and tools and things that we find there to bring back in a way that helps people get excited about that future. But our crew have also this extraordinary, powerful quantum device, which I will unveil for you now. You can feel it, right? This is arranging you already, even through the power of the internet. This is rearranging you on a kind of molecular level, this thing. And so I'm going to use it. We can use it to go backwards and forwards, but we usually just use it to travel forwards 10 years into the future that was the result of us doing everything we possibly could have done, the future of our deep, deep, deep longing. So I'm going to ask if you might, in the same way that Cass just did, I'm going to start by asking you if you might close your eyes and put your feet on the floor again. And take another one of those beautiful deep breaths that Cass got us trained up with just now. And I'd like you to imagine that you are lifting out of the present. You are breaking free of the bondage of time that keeps us in the present, and you are rising up out of that and starting to travel forwards through time, through 2027, 2028, 2029, 2030. These years, you can feel them running past you like wind across your face. And those years that we're traveling through in a way that we never predicted in 2026 turned out to be the most thrilling adventure that we could ever have anticipated. 2031, 2032, 2033, the work that you and so many other people did during this time to turn things around is now celebrated in story and song by the people who marvel at your courage and imagination and bravery in creating this world. 2034, 2035, and we're going to circle round and touch down here in the 2036 that is the result of your longing. It's the future that you longed into existence and worked very hard to bring about. But it's the future of your longing, of your desire. It's not utopia, and it's definitely not a dystopia. It's the future that resulted from us doing everything we possibly could have done. And I'm just going to pop open the hatch here on the device that I've brought you and ask you to take a step outside into that 2036. Take a deep breath as you land and step into that world that resulted from us doing everything we could have possibly done. And we'll take a minute then in silence for you to take a walk around in it, but do so using all of your senses. What does that world smell like? What does it feel like on your skin? What does it taste like? What can you see? What can you hear? Off you go. So it's time to begin our trip back. You can remember and savor the scents and the tastes of this world. You'll always carry it with you. And just going to invite you to pop up here next to me in my seat here in our time traveling machine. And I'm going to set the controls to take us back. So you can wave farewell as we go back to 2035, 2034, 2033, 2032, 2031, 2030, 2029, 2028, 2027. And we're going to touch down back here into the present, bringing with us those memories, those artifacts, those sensations from that future. And it would be beautiful if we could just take a couple of minutes, if you can open your eyes now, and welcome back again to 2026, which hopefully you'll now be able to see through new eyes and new possibilities. And we're just going to use the chat. so that you can share in there any impressions, just a few words, just any little tastes of what that world looked like to you, what it smelt like to you, that future of your longing. And then I can read those as we go past. So dive into the chat and share some impressions. Bird song in town. Thank you, Joe. Liberation from capitalism. Clean. There were a lot less cars, cleaner and quieter. Warm sun, cool wind, rich smell of soil, clean water, rewilded, the freshest of air. Smelt green and a fresh rain. So many trees, music and birds. Nobody eats animals or animal excretions. Community, clean water rushing, rivers, fat leaping salmon, greenery, dolphins, green cities. Thank you, Sarah D. Rivers teeming with life, very lush green forest, rainy and warm. Bird song, trees, warm sunlight, fresh air, music and people playing, sound of children playing. We managed to keep the moon safe from interference. I could smell the clean air and the blossoming flowers in the farmland of a regenerative village. Children can walk freely on the roads, very few cars. All the streets of my market town are full of flowers and fruit trees. Vibrant bird song, insect buzzing, hardly any cars, fresh air, lots of birds, fresh cooking smells from every home, fruit from our community orchard, dirt roads, people talking to each other more, people outside as much as possible, making and growing things. Love, thank you, Louise. Clean, fresh water, abundant plants and food, smells of jasmine and fresh bread being baked. People love singing and dancing, kindness and love, animals strolling freely, freely connected smiles. Forested lands and hearts, hawthorn and hugging. That's very beautiful. Thank you. Fresh air, like in COVID when the earth came to a halt. Trees, lots of trees. People giving care to each other without haste. More mothers and grandmothers in power, putting future generations at the heart of decision making. Beautiful. Thank you all for this. Queues at the food bank replaced by a crowd of people swapping food they've grown. I'll let you read down through the rest of these in your own time. They're very, very lovely. Thank you. The future is more green, edible, food goes everywhere, smells fresh and like equity and justice somehow. Smells like fresh jasmine and bread being baked. Some beautiful. So I was figuring out the other day that I've done this activity, I think, in the last 5 years with about 15,000 people. And so far, no one has ever said, Rob, we have a new IKEA that's 4 times bigger than the one we used to have. It's so cool. There's something really kind of universal about what this taps into, I think. And I always think that doing this should be a daily practice in the same way that yoga, meditation, or running is, because not doing this, because what we all do in our daily lives is the complete opposite of this exercise. We wake up, we turn on our phones, and our phones say, oh God, oh, and the future just disappears. And when we live in a time where the future is being cancelled and colonized, I think it's really, really, really profoundly dangerous. And as the great bell hooks said, what we cannot imagine cannot come into being. And we have to do this work. And the more that we do it, I think the more that it comes into focus, the more clarity that we see that future in. And there's a woman called Elise Boulding, who was a Quaker and who was one of the people who was a pioneer of peace studies as an academic subject. Amazing woman. And she did a very similar exercise to this in men's prisons in the US in the early 90s. And she wrote this beautiful paper of what they told her they saw in that future, and it's identical to what you've been describing to me here. And she said her conclusion was, I think we have many more co-workers for the work ahead than we might think we do. And we so rarely start like this. We usually start in the present and all the things that are wrong in the present, rather than going forwards and then figuring out how we got there. And we'll go into this a little bit more. And I love there's a woman in Berlin called Wasima Labic, who does this amazing work that she calls Muslim Futures, working with Muslim women in Berlin who experience daily racism in that city. And she wrote this beautiful article called On Sensual Futuring, where she talks about this idea of sensual futuring and how she brings smell and taste and touch and all these things into her work. And so for me, reading all these lists of different things that you could all smell in that future is a beautiful practice of sensual futuring. And when I do workshops, we usually do an exercise called making sense of the future, but as in SCENTS, where I give everybody a cup and ask them to go outside and make in that cup a cocktail of smells that smelt like the future that they imagined. And then I invite them all back and we have a cocktail party. I rearrange the chairs so they're all crammed into a small space, like as if they're in a party in a little apartment in Paris or something. And you have to get around the room and you have to give your cocktail a good name, because all good cocktails have names. And so they go around and they introduce, this is my cocktail, and then they smell them and then they keep moving. And it always reminds me of that lovely thing that Rilke said about the future must enter into you a long time before it happens. And for me, exercises like this help us to do that. It takes the future. What would a truly low carbon, more just, fair, equal, beautiful future be like if we can take it out of policy documents that don't mean anything to anybody, statistics and numbers that don't mean anything to anybody, and bring it in a way that is sensual and starts to get into people's bones? That's kind of part of the work that I do now that I find really, really thrilling and exciting. So thank you all so much for time traveling with me. In the book, How to Fall in Love with the Future, the last chapter, some people are very kind of protective of intellectual property. I'm kind of the opposite. I'm like, here's all the exercises that I do, all the tools, take them and run with them. The last chapter is called Your Time Machine Blueprint, and it's all the different things that I do and how to use them. And this is just one of them. So take them and run with them. And let me know how it goes. Cass, back to you. I'll turn the time machine off before the dinosaurs start appearing and stuff. You have to be a bit careful with this kind of technology.
Whoa. Thank you so much for that time traveling practice. I would actually love to open it up and hear from a couple of people. Um, what did you experience? Where did you go? I would love to know how that felt in your body. And yeah, just invite a couple of voices into the room. Anybody interested in sharing?
Hello. I don't mind sharing. I found it really interesting because whilst I was traveling over places very distant from me. And then when we touched down in 2036, I was effectively in the neighborhood that I'm in right now, but just slightly warmer, slightly, it's actually on a road that's got 5 lanes of traffic. So it was beautifully quieter as EVs had become more established. And there were lovely interactions happening between people.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Looks like a couple of other people were also in their immediate neighborhood or a familiar setting.
I'm not sure where I was, but I felt profoundly grateful that people had changed. So it wasn't so much about the environment for me as a sense that people's values had shifted, and that it was a peaceful world where people don't kill other animals any longer, because I see killing animals as the fundamental violence in our planet. And so it was just safe. It was a safe world where people understood that killing any being is totally wrong.
Yeah, it's always a thing that when I go there that I'm impressed by is the thing that already by 2036 we eat about 75-80% less meat than we did back in 2026, but that nobody really noticed that change happening. There was like always made out like it was such a big deal and such an impossible thing, but it just sort of was just shifting in the background, and nobody really noticed. Like a lot of the changes turned out to be much easier than we imagined they were going to be. And Rob's asking if I've done this with teenagers, and I'll just tell you a little story about that. Actually, I was in Dudley.
Okay, I would also just add to that, like without the taxonomy work, what you're talking about, I don't think.
Oh, sorry. Go on. Okay. Shall I continue? Sorry, I didn't. I think somebody started talking there. So, I did a workshop in Dudley recently in the West Midlands here in the UK, and it was for a group of about 60-70 people from different organizations across Dudley. It was really interesting, and there was a group of 8 young people there who were community health champions, who were like 14, I guess, probably. And we did, and when I do this time travel exercise in a big group, I get everybody to stand up, and they stand in a big circle, and I stand in the middle. And I asked them to close their eyes and imagine there's a door in front of them. And I describe this door. And on the other side of that door is 2036. And so then they close their eyes, and then I describe what we're going to do. And on the other side of that door is the 2036 that resulted from us doing everything we could have done. And then I asked them to physically turn the handle and physically step through into that future. So it's kind of, I guess, anything that gives it like that sense of a threshold, that you're stepping over a threshold. And then at the end, I ask everybody, I put people into pairs and ask them to keep their eyes closed with the person next to them. And I asked them to share, first of all, with that other person, what did you see? What did you feel? And if you keep your eyes closed, you're held more in that space still. You're like reporting back from something you can still see. And then I ask everyone to close their eyes, to open their eyes, and then to just share anything with the circle. And so very like we've seen in the chat now, normally when I do this exercise, you get the kind of things that people have been saying here. And one of these girls said, there was just darkness and heartbreak and loneliness. And then I went to another girl next to her who said there was just despair and bleakness and loss. And and the point is, when you facilitate this, everything is welcome into that to be said. I'm not going to go, no, wrong answer. It's like, actually, of course, whatever people see is as valued as what anybody else sees. And then we follow that. But then they got to stand in a circle with 60 other adults who were saying the very sort of things that we're seeing here in the chat. And it really struck me then that they never do that. Like, that never happens. The future is being cancelled and colonized for so many young people, and it's just disappeared. And because what we do then in the workshop is we follow that up, then where we put people into groups of 6, and I give them big sheets of paper and crayons and a big pile of old magazines and scissors and glue sticks and pens, and say, create an image that speaks to what you all saw in common when you did that exercise. And all the young people stayed together on the same table. I thought, oh God, they're going to rinse through the black crayons, and this is going to be a pretty bleak thing. But actually, because they'd had that experience of standing and hearing adults say, I saw this, I saw that, there was a stronger sense of community, and there was purpose, and that actually then when I went round when they were working in the groups, it was really kind of quite phenomenal. And then at the end, when they left, at the end, the teacher said, they've been on a real journey today. And so there's something, I think, that actually about when you do this, like the more diverse the groups you can bring together to do this, the more interesting stuff you get from it, I think. And definitely all the times I've done this with having young people in the room and in the space has just been kind of extraordinary, really.
I really liked the idea of a 10-year horizon, because I think when we're trying to imagine otherwise, when there's so much overwhelm, it feels so difficult to grasp. And that idea of what's possible, what are those small shifts, how are we attentive to them? And I think when you sort of start to break it down, it allows more people to step into it and to think about it.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you, Demi. And part of the reason for that is my experience is if you say we're going to go to 2070, everybody, that actually apocalypse comes in very, very easily. Either everything's on fire or underwater, or just technology has just gone completely rampant. And there's a book by Jane McGonigal called Imaginable, where she has this list of big shifts that happened in 10-year timeframes. And so it took 10 years from Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on the bus to the first Civil Rights Act being passed in the US, 10 years from the first international sanctions on South Africa to the new constitution in South Africa. She has like 3 pages of them. 10 years from the first same-sex marriage in the Netherlands to polls showing that more than 50% of people around the world thought that this was a good thing. And it's like, actually, so I always say to people, a lot can change in 10 years. And in the show that we're creating at the moment, which I'll say a bit more about in a little bit, called Field Recordings from the Future, we have a section where we look back 10 years and talk about what were the best-selling toys 10 years ago. Can anyone even remember those things? That's the fidget spinners. Who still remembers fidget spinners? That was 10 years ago. So it's it feels like a nice distance to me to play around with. Sarah.
Hiya. Thanks.
Hello.
I just wanted to go back to that kind of previous thing about diversity of audience in the room. And I wondered whether you'd done this with people with a diversity of views, because, we feel quite divided, perhaps, in our viewpoints at the moment. And I'm wondering, you said about people not wishing to see a larger IKEA, but I'm wondering if there are some difficult things that people might bring up that we would feel perhaps were difficult things in their desires for the next 10 years. Whether you've done that with a broader kind of set of viewpoints and what came of that, or what surprises happened for you?
I mean, I guess to a certain extent, I tend to be doing it with audiences who self-select to a certain degree. But also at bigger events that I do, people often bring along their skeptical partner or parent or brother or sister or whatever it is. But actually in July, I'm doing some work with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and doing a 5-day tour, taking the training that I do to Middlesbrough and Durham and York and Hartlepool and places that are quite kind of reformy right now. So I'm very interested with that. I think the thing, when I do that exercise, like, I don't start by setting out my political stall before that starts, which feels really important to me. It's not like, okay, the only right answers are things you might find in a Green Party pamphlet. It's really like, and then, because then what I do is then I follow that up with a report back from a trip that I recently took to 2036. But when I do that, because I don't want people to be able to say, well, of course, everyone imagined birdsong and bicycles, because you just showed them slides for half an hour of birdsong and bicycles. So, of course, that's what happened. But it's the thing that is most fascinating to me is that even without doing that, is how common that is. I do get, I mean, I guess there are sometimes people who say, I couldn't see anything positive. The whole world was just on fire and everything was awful. But I don't, and it's always surprising how little technology there is in people's responses to this. And I've done this. I spoke last week at a big conference of software programmers in London, and then I did a thing to people at Google doing this. And I kind of think when you ask people to leave their professional role to one side and to show up just as them and as parents and grandparents and sons and daughters and to show up as ourselves, it makes it kind of easier, I think. But ask me when I come back from my Northeast tour.
Yeah, I'd be really interested.
Yeah, no, me too. It's kind of the reason why I was like, oh yeah, that would be good. I did it in a working men's club in Blackpool, which for people outside the UK is the poorest city in the country, or very, very disadvantaged place. And people still, I'd say that probably the level of kind of ambition was much, much smaller because that's people's life experience. But still, it was like people were like, God, I've never done this. I've never thought about the future in this kind of way before. Yeah. Catherine.
Hi, thanks, Rob. I'm a bit starstruck. I'm such a huge fan. But I just want, so I'm trying to think about the concept of like how these different areas with different, you know, the socioeconomic background and like how the sense of like agency and ability to change your circumstances kind of lead on from this imagination practice. Like I could imagine some, you know, some communities kind of being, well, this is all very well, but when they come back to 2026 feeling quite, you know, unagentic, feeling a little bit like, well, that's just made it worse, you know, because I'm not in control of my next steps. I don't, you know, whereas, you know, and interested to hear what you're saying about the people who kind of self-select because they've already sort of demonstrated agency. We've all demonstrated agency by coming to this call today. So I just kind of, if you have any reflections on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. One of my great heroes or sheroes in this work is someone called Mariam Kaba, who's a prison abolition activist in the United States, wrote a book called We Do This Till We Free Us, which is one of the great works, I think, of the kind of radical political imagination. It's fantastic. And in that book, she says, we must imagine while we build, always both. We must imagine while we build, always both. And you know, because this for me, this work that I do comes out of being of the transition movement for the last 20 years, of being very, very centrally involved in that, which is very much in that spirit of, you know, for me, when I grew up, a huge influence for me was punk, and punk had that wonderful picture of how to play 3 chords on a guitar, and it said, here are 3 chords, now form a band. And that kind of spirit, I just love it. It's like, come on, it's not that hard. We can, like, all of this stuff. And so there was a film that some of you probably saw a few years ago, an Australian film called 2040 by Damon Gapo, where he sort of creates this impression of the world that he wants his daughter to grow up into in 2040 using CGI. And some of it I loved and some of it I wasn't quite so sure about. But he called that film an experiment in evidence-based dreaming. And I love that. And so for me, it's like, so what I do in a workshop or in a conference is that I start out with the exercise that we just did. And then I tell people I'm going to give them a report back on a recent trip that we took there. Sorry, that's my phone. I'm going to give them a feedback, a report on a recent trip. I say, you might like to think of me as being like the kind of Marco Polo of the climate movement, you know, reporting back on an amazing adventure. And then I show them pictures. I say, we went to 2036 and I took my camera and look, we documented this, and I take them to visit the bicycle rush hours of that city, the underground bicycle parking, the incredible new food infrastructure, the urban agriculture, the way that we now measure progress, not through GDP, but through a whole set of well-being indicators. And we saw this and we saw that, and the return of the beavers all over the, you know, but with pictures, most of which I've taken. And then kind of at the end, then the big reveal is, well, actually, all of these things that I've just shown you from 2036 all already exist in 2026. And the future's already here. It's just not evenly distributed, as William Gibson said. And then I go off into stories about how we behave differently as activists that meant that we got there. But for me, it's like, it's really important. And I mentioned before, you know, we're developing this touring. I've been working on this project for the last couple of years called Field Recordings from the Future, with an amazing ambient electronic music artist called Mr. Kit. And the idea of Field Recordings from the Future is that I go to visit places that already sound like the future. If you want to experience what it would be like to travel forwards 10 years in time, get the Eurostar to Utrecht in Holland and sit by the train station at 8 o'clock in the morning, and 125,000 bicycles cycle into the center of Utrecht every morning because they built the infrastructure for that to happen. And it's insane. Or go to Freiburg in Germany, to Vauban, which is the biggest car-free neighborhood in Europe. 3,000 people live in this neighborhood with no cars. it's like stepping into the future. When I was 25 at university, they put us all on a bus and took us to Denmark for 2 weeks, and we spent 2 weeks visiting co-housing projects and offshore wind farms and cycling infrastructure. And it was like we'd been taken forwards 20 years into the future, and came home saying, oh, we've got a lot of work to do here, people, but we know that we can do it. So for me, it's like actually grounding the stories in, my hope is that actually then when I bring people back, and by the end of that process, they have seen enough stories of places that look like where they live and people who look like them, and stories that feel kind of possible and doable. None of it, like if the story is, and then AI solved everything, you don't get to the end of that story feeling any kind of sense of agency or that you have any role to play. All the stories that I tell are because people came together and made that happen. They became their own energy companies, their own housing developers. They became their own food producers. And that's what tipped this economy that we're seeing emerging around us now. So it's the stories that you tell and how you tell them. I think you can tell them in a way that they convey a sense of agency and possibility with them, rather than just like, and then something magic happened.
Thank you.
Thanks. Louise.
Oh, you caught me off guard. Apologies, I've got my camera turned off. Oh my goodness, I have a number of questions, but I'm trying to keep them quite succinct. I put a comment in the chat box about this idea that many of us are living with, well, first of all, collective trauma, and depletion and exhaustion being a political condition of our time. And I'm really reflective of the fact that much of the imagination practices are very good and very rich in terms of frameworking and processes for bringing people into the space, in terms of holding them in a container in that space. What do you think needs to happen to get those people into the space where they actually believe in what they're imagining? Because, if I think about, and you mentioned this before about how the future has been cancelled. If I think about anyone that's progressive in their thinking, anyone that is future thinking orientated, end state orientated, really thinking about system reorientation, not just system improvement or system redesign. Those people are called fruitcakes, they're called idealistic, they're called naive. So we enter into these processes, I assume, and I've seen this, with this level of aspiration that we think is possible, and we enter in at that level of imagination. So therefore, what we imagine would be what we believe could be possible. So I'm just wondering if you've got any reflections on that. It's not really a firm question, but I just I see the gap in aspiration and imagination. I think they're different, and I think that yeah.
Okay.
What are your thoughts?
Thank you. Yeah. So I feel like so I have a long kind of background around Tibetan Buddhism, and I always love how in Tibetan Buddhism the word compassion, which in Western culture is seen as something a bit sort of floppy and just being nice to people, in Tibetan Buddhism they talk about compassion as being like a diamond or a flash of lightning, like it's a powerful kind of a very, very powerful thing. And I kind of feel that we need to we need to think about imagination in the same way. Imagination is absolutely not a luxury. Imagine having a healthy, vigorous imagination is really an indicator that everything else is in balance and in health. The fact that we have an education system that produces so many young people there was an article recently in the paper of a teacher who when kids arrived into secondary school on their first day, she asked them to make up a story and write it down, and kids burst into tears. It's like what have we done? So it's for me, I feel like I come out fighting for the imagination with the same passion that I would come out fighting for anything else. And when people particularly, and actually when people say, oh well, you know, this is very naive to imagine things, that gets me going, because I'm like, okay, we've just spent, when we started the transition movement in 2006, and I wrote a book called The Transition Handbook, which some of you might have seen. And that book made a very clear, very strong, I thought, case that our dependency on oil and gas and fossil fuels represents a key economic vulnerability and weakness, and that we need to move away from that as rapidly as possible, and that actually that would unlock and enable a very different kind of future that would be far better than the fossil fuel one. Actually, and I was called very naive. Rob, that's very naive. What are you talking about? That's completely naive. That's never going to happen. You're very naive. Actually, what happened instead was that the European Union sent Russia 18 billion euros every month for natural gas. And then look where that ended up. You know, so it's like, and we were told during that whole time there was no money to decarbonize. There was no money to do the kind of things we were talking about. And you're very naive to imagine that there was the resources to do that. And actually, of course we could have. Of course we could have. And so I really come out fighting on that and saying, actually, the naive thing is to imagine that there is anything at the end of a business as usual path going forwards that is not absolutely catastrophic and apocalyptic. You know, that's the key takeaway from climate science, is if we just carry on doing what we're doing and we don't change anything, we're headed for something unimaginably awful. So why don't we instead focus on imagining something really different? And I think you're really right to point to that link with trauma. And there's Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, which I'm sure many of you will have read. Amazing book about trauma, and how he writes in there about how damaging cortisol is to our imagination. We have to recognize from the outset of this conversation that imagination in some ways is a function of privilege. If you're in Gaza right now, if you're in Sudan right now, if you're in Lebanon, being able to imagine the future in hopeful, positive, optimistic ways is absolutely not something that is evenly distributed. And so those of us who are in the privileged position to do that have to recognize that this is a privilege and a responsibility that comes with that, to imagine the world, I think, in very different ways. And the thing that when I wrote From What Is to What If, that for me was a big sort of aha moment, was about the hippocampus. So the hippocampus is the part of your brain where your memory and your imagination both fire from. And it's also the part of the brain. So if you're imagining the future or remembering the past, it's exactly the same neural pathways that kick in when we do both of those things. And but it's also the part of the brain that is most vulnerable to cortisol. So when we are stressed or in trauma or in anxiety, the hippocampus can shrink by up to 20%. And when that happens, that ability to think about the future in positive, hopeful ways disappears. And we get stuck in the present and stuck in the past. And I feel like we are living very much in a cortisol economy right now. And there are so many people who are so awash with cortisol through no fault of their own, through the way that the system has been engineered and designed, that actually the future, that's kind of one of the key drivers for why the future has sort of disappeared for so many people. So creating the space for that is why I think a universal basic income or something like that is one of the most important imagination strategies we can have, because it takes the precariousness out of our culture. So So yeah, I think for me, it's like we have to recognize that this is not a superpower that's evenly distributed, and that we have to create the conditions for it. And so one of the things that's been really lovely, I did a workshop in Dundee recently with an organization there, Dundee Changemakers, the Dundee Changemakers Hub, and they had some funding so that we could go through a process of had like 90 people there for a day, and we did this very beautiful, playful, deep imagining workshop, reimagining the future of Dundee. And then we got to the end, and they said, we have 5 pots of £1,000. If you've got an idea here that has come up out of this workshop and you need some support to help move it on to the next stage, come and talk to us. And the same thing when we do this tour with JRF around the northeast of England in July, it'll be the same thing. You know, we have to, I think if you ask people to be imaginative, you have to then also meet them in the middle and give them some kind of, the experience we need to give people is, well, we imagined that, and it happened. So what else could we imagine? And so many people never ever have that experience. And that should be one of the main things for me that government, local and national, should be enabling, is people having that kind of experience. Andrea.
Rob, I would actually love to jump in, and there's
Please.
2 threads that you have been touching on that are also super active in the chat, and would love to shift the conversation a little bit. The first thread is really around this collective nervous system regulation, and how there are many folks who don't have access to their creativity, to their imagination, because of the conditions they're living in. And then the second part is the shifting from like, okay, we imagine the thing, we see the possibility, we feel it, we feel energized, and then how do we move from that moment to action, like taking the action, taking the step, taking that movement forward towards the future that you're living, rather than sitting in that possibility, to allow that future to come closer to us, and to really live into that. So I would love to talk a little bit about both the bringing more folks into the space, who may not have access to that creativity or imagination. How do we navigate or support folks who are not in spaces where the conditions really create space for possibility to even be accessible on a regular basis? And then for those of us who are in that privileged space to imagine, how do we not just sit in that possibility, but actually take action for the collective as a collective responsibility, and in that role as a practitioner.
Yeah. So so in terms of the last one there, I would point people towards some of the resources that have come out of the transition movement. So the transition movement, which started in 2006, was always very much around that idea of bringing communities together to talk about and vision the future they want to see, and then to go and make it happen. There's a very good free guide called The Essential Guide to Doing Transition, which you can find on the Transition Network's website in about 35 different languages, I think, which is a kind of a distillation of everything that we've learned from that. So just one example, in my town, in Totnes, we from very early on, we did big kind of open space events, big bringing people together to really kind of imagine the future that they wanted for the town. And one of the key things that came through that was, we need homes that people can actually afford to live in this town. And the market is failing completely to provide those. And the local authority is completely failing to deliver those. And so maybe we could become our own developer. And so a project came through that, which is called Transition Homes. And Transition Homes, the idea was to build 39 homes in community ownership at a rent that people can afford, that would be in community ownership forever. That project is now on site, is being built. The first families will move into those houses in September, and I couldn't be prouder of that. And when I look at that, I can think back to the imagining sessions where we dreamt that project. Do you know what I mean? So it's like, actually, if we just, what I am absolutely not saying in this session is we just all need to sit around and just imagine and dream all the time. That it's nice, but it doesn't move us forward in the enormous poly crisis that we're sitting in right now. And so for me, it's like Mariam Kaba said, like I said before, we must imagine while we build, always both. In terms of how do we support folks in non-conducive places for this, I have to say that I've spent a long time around the climate movement, as part of the climate movement, and I got bored of reading books by middle-aged white men about collapse. There's so many of them, and it's like, oh really, you're just cottoning on? It's like, it's, that's been the state for so many people for a very, very long time. And and they may well be right in terms of what they're painting the picture of, but in terms of mobilizing people, it doesn't work, I don't think, at the scale that we need. And so in recent years, I take so much more inspiration, actually mostly from women of color in the US, Adrienne Marie Brown, Walida Imarisha, Ruha Benjamin, Mariam Kaba, people like Black Quantum Futurism, Rashida Phillips and More Mother, who did this phenomenal project called Black Quantum Futurism, which is about playing with time in different ways, and the links that how much linear time is a kind of colonial construct, and keeps us locked into this particular way of doing things, and how traditional African understandings of time were so different, and where time ran backwards, and all these extraordinary sorts of things. And they do this. If you've never come across Black Quantum Futurism, look up their website. It's phenomenal. Thank you, Cass, for putting that in the chat. I love everything that they do. Rashida Phillips wrote a book called Dismantling the Master's Clock, which came out last year, which is phenomenal book. And their work was very much like partly grounded in this sort of extraordinary work around time and space and stuff, and also very grounded in their community. So they were in North Philadelphia. They took over an empty shop on their high street in a neighborhood that was being gentrified. And kind of Rashida Phillips's day job is working as a housing lawyer, helping keep people in their homes during a big process of gentrification. And they opened what they called a community futures lab, which is in an old cafe there, where they would collect people's oral futures, not their oral histories, their oral futures. And I love this idea that actually this kind of time travel practice at its best is something when it's really radically grounded in communities. My friend Ruth Bentovim, who's an amazing community artist who does a project called Town Anywhere, this beautiful practice where you bring people together to imagine the future and then build it with cardboard and string and sticky tape and pens, is one of the most phenomenal things. And that works really, really well kind of as a community practice. One of the great kind of heroes and inspirations in this work for me is the great Sun Ra, the jazz musician Sun Ra, who talked a lot, who was a musician in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, early 90s, who told this amazing story about himself where he said, "I'm not actually a human being, I'm an angel from Saturn." And he talked about space travel as a different way of thinking about Black liberation and how people like the Black Panthers were at that time. And he said a beautiful thing once, which was, "The future is obvious, but the potential impossible is calling softly and knocking gently," which I think is so gorgeous. And he died in 1993 in North Philadelphia. And there's now in North Philadelphia, there's an organization called Street Work with the word tree put into brackets. And they are about promoting tree planting in North Philadelphia, particularly in the poorer neighborhoods of color with very low tree cover, which as that city warms, it becomes a real public health hazard that's the case. And so they launched and they did an event to launch this idea of reforesting North Philadelphia. But they didn't do it by publishing a boring report called the North Philadelphia Reforestation Plan 2040 or something. They did it by, they did an event in the Arboretum where they invited Sun Ra's orchestra, who still play, even though they're in their 80s, 90s. The band leader just turned 101 and just released his first solo album, which is aging in style, I think. But they invited them to play. And then they called this event Summoning the Future Forest. Oh, it's so beautiful. Summoning the future forest. Like, it's just over there. We just need to create something sufficiently delicious and extraordinary and magical that we summon it into the present. And I think for me doing this work, there's a theatricality to it. And I read an article about Sun Ra that described him as being an everyday utopian, which I love. They said, he's read this thing that said all of his band looked like a school nativity play where everyone had decided to come as one of the three kings. And they all lived in a house together and they dressed like that all the time. If they were going down the corner shop to buy a pint of milk or go to the laundrette, they all dressed like that. And in this article, it said that Sun Ra did everything he did with an unshakable certainty and deadpan humor. And for me, when I try and facilitate this, whoever I'm facilitating this stuff with, that's the spirit I bring. It's like, I'm not here to debate whether we've built a time machine. I've got it here. It's in a little box. Just the question is, where are we going and what are we going to do when we get there? And there's a kind of audacity to that and an embrace of, actually, I don't mind if people think that's a bit silly anymore. And I went to art school when I was 18 and I learned to draw. And then I kept drawing through all the time of of having kids and stuff. But then most of my work was, there was activist Rob and artist Rob. And artist Rob might occasionally get to draw on holiday when the kids were on the beach, and activist Rob was what I did. And then actually working with Ruth Bentovim and the phenomenal stuff she does, it's been about bringing those things back together again. And Field Recordings from the Future, which we're going to be touring later this year, which is going to be this amazing live music kind of Lumiere projection theatrical show where we pick the audience up in 2026 and we take them to 2036. And we're going to be doing in Sheffield and Bristol and the Globe Theatre in London and some other places as well. Is very much a kind of about bringing those things back together again for me, with that Sun Ra spirit of unshakable certainty and deadpan humor. Cass, should we hear from Andrea, do you think, who has waited very, very patiently?
Yeah, I was going to stack Andrea, Andres, and Ola.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Perfect.
Okay.
Well, thank you.
Amazing, thank you. Rob, I'm a huge fan, and you've inspired a lot of my work, and actually now I'm getting a little bit lost with what is it that I'm going to ask, because it's a little bit similar. So I do very similar work, and I'm always so inspired by people coming to my workshops and doing a time traveling and then creating beautiful stories of the future. And today I had a very interesting experience, like with this imagination. It was like a very beautiful community in the forest, and all of a sudden I've been having a conversation today about the situation in Mexico and the narco, and all of a sudden that came into my imagination, and it made me feel like very like the imposter syndrome of how is imagination helping the situations of the world. And you've been talking about the privilege of imagination and why it is important, and I understand that, but I wonder if you maybe, like, how do you deal with the imposter syndrome, and maybe also how do you, when you see all the challenges that feel so impossible, like the violence in the world, how do you keep going? Or I don't know how, I don't know if I'm the question I want to ask.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there's a big difference between standing up in front of people and saying, this is what will happen, and standing up in front of people and saying, this is what could happen. Do you know what I mean? It's like when I do this work, it doesn't come with any guarantees. But I think the point is, if we don't open up the possibilities, then we just get stuck. You know, it's like I hear. So I did a talk in Bristol recently, and someone in the audience said, "What's the point of this, Rob? Because, you know, everybody knows that Nigel Farage is going to be the next prime minister." And I'm like, that's just a story. And over my dead body, is that going to be the? Do you know? It's like, actually, come on. This is not. It's not a passive. For me, this is not like sort of passive, nicey work. This is really like, actually, you know, for me, the stuff that I do is underpinned partly by rage, I have to say, and it's not. And you know, and I always, people say, "Oh, Rob, how are you optimistic all the time?" I'm like, if I met anyone who was optimistic all the time, I would be as worried about their mental health as somebody who was pessimistic all the time. Really, this is about finding skillful tools, I think. You know, this is not that somehow, and part of the thing for me about traveling to 2036, and I think maybe it was Joanne who before said about talking about traveling just 10 years forward into the future, is that actually we get so easily, you know, when I talk to people who are like script writers and stuff, and they say, well, you know, the thing with utopia is it's really boring because nothing exciting happens in utopias. And actually all the drama and excitement is in dystopias. And that's why we have so many dystopian films. And I'm like, okay, can we put that sort of duality to one side? Because we're not talking about utopias or dystopias. We're talking about a 2036. We're going 10 years forward into the future. People still get sick. People still fall out with each other. It's not like everything has been magically resolved. But the point is that 2036 I'm trying to take people to is a world where we've changed direction, and we're where the science tells us we have to get to. And the point is that there are so many stories that just take us away from that. Either like, oh no, we don't need to worry about that because tech will solve everything, or we can't do that because it's impossible. I'm like, we have to do that because that's like physics and stuff, and that's actual like science by credible scientists who are credible because they're credible, and that's what we have to have done. So all I'm doing is trying to bring that world alive, which is just tends to be stuck in the pages of boring documents. And it's not that we've solved everything. Like, people still get sick. There'll still be. It's a world where there is still problems that we have to resolve. But what's it like if we allow ourselves to imagine that actually doing everything we need to do in order to unpick the climate emergency actually turned out to be the thing that allowed us to unpick so many other things as well, and health and well-being and mental well-being for young people? And what would it be like to live in a world where that was happening? So, it's not like, when I do workshops and we do the kind of what we call the walk of what if, where we then do a lot of work with what if and getting people coming up with, well, what were the what if questions that we thought of in 2026 that meant that we were able to create that 2036? I always say to people, make them as grounded in reality as you can. So what if my organization worked with your organization in that place to do that? What if we all became vegan? Is not that useful a question. Whereas what if my organization and your organization came together to do a plant-based thing working with local producers? Now that's much more interesting. Do you know what I mean? So for me, it's like we have to, it's of course there are massive kind of intractable problems, but a lot of those problems, that the thing that resolved them was making space for the imagination that they didn't have to be like that. I've spoken to, when I was doing the research for the book, and when I was in my teens, I went on lots of anti-apartheid marches in London and was quite involved with those campaigns at the time. But I met somebody who was more involved, who said, yeah, all the big events that we did, they also included making space to dream into what a free South Africa would be like. And a friend of mine in Northern Ireland shared with me some beautiful videos of videos that were made in the run-up to the Good Friday Agreement, that were kind of set in a future where the two communities were kind of getting along, and they're really quite moving and beautiful. There's some of them on YouTube, I think. So actually, quite often those big shifts are preceded by the people who say, well, maybe it doesn't have to be like this. Like if Martin Luther King had stood up and said, I have a nightmare and it was horrible, let me tell you about it. I think that's kind of quite different from the kind of the bringing the I have a dream sort of sense into it. Hopefully that's
Thank you for that. It's something I put in the chat is critical mass and critical connection. Like, we think a lot about increasing the number of folks that are dreaming, that are practicing collective imagination, that are imagining these futures. And I feel like another piece of this puzzle is like, let's dream together, let's imagine together, let's organize together, not just in these sort of one-off spaces, but like, now that those spaces are activated, what does it look like to come together and create movement from that space, solidarity from that space, organizing from that space, and how much further can we go getting these futures that live in these policy documents and pages into the actual world, which I love that metaphor, because I feel like that is often where our imagination gets funneled into as a counter-resistance strategy almost. Like, when we think about imagining, we go to the policy, we go to the government officials, we go to the nonprofit spaces, and there is a time and a place for that. And also there's so much more that can be done if that imagination gets pushed into these other kinds of actionable spaces. And so that's something that I'm definitely going to be percolating on as we leave this space. I want to do a time check. We have about 20 minutes, and we got 3 hands left. So I actually would love to hear the questions that y'all 3 have, and then and that those 3 are Andres, Ola, and Yuri, and then Rob can respond to those pretty organically, and then
that's a good idea.
We'll close together.
Andres,
to you. Yeah.
Hello, thank you. I guess it feels to me that all the people who were raising questions before me, that there feels to be a pattern to all of this, which and my will be in a similar kind of vein, which is how do you avoid how do you avoid your thing, which is imagining the future in different settings, become part of the paradigm which you want to change? So what I'm well, just to give it a bit of a framework. So I'm pretty sure a couple of people here is familiar with the Three Horizons framework, and which was a basic idea originally, and when people started to practice it, actually, so it became practice from theory, then they figured out that the middle horizon, which is supposed to be a bridge between the outgoing paradigm and the coming paradigm, that and every single specific innovation or practice or whatever, which is dreamed up as a second horizon thing, is either a second minus or a second plus, in a sense that a second minus is something which actually just improves the system, the Horizon 1 paradigm, without changing its modus operandi. And second Horizon Plus is something which actively and deliberately and chosenly goes against the modus operandi of the existing paradigm. And by doing so, it actually undermines its own existential foundation, because it has to operate in the dominantly Horizon 1 environment.
Yeah.
And all what matters is how long a second Horizon Plus innovation can hold on and carry on, all during that time nurturing the modus operandi of the third horizon, which it wants to bring along. And the really difficult thing for me to grasp here is that all of these innovations and practices in the we can all agree, I guess, that we are not in Horizon 3. So there is a change needed. But what is needing to be changed? It's depending on how you answer that question, you will end up with different practices in Horizon 2, and some of them will just reinforce Horizon 1. And it all boils down to the same question of how inclusive you are, how much you are losing your privilege of whatever privilege you got, doing whatever you are doing, and how you can actually devise something which involves those who do not want to be involved, because their attention is colonized by the paradigm which is the status quo. So Horizon 1.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ola? Or maybe it was just someone Spanish saying, hola. That would be with an H, wouldn't it? Okay, well, maybe Yuri.
Sorry, I'm so sorry. I was trying to figure out how to do the unmute button. I was flailing around. I was like, oh my gosh. And how do I get my video up as well? I swear to you, I'm a millennial. I know how to use technology. There we go.
We're not convinced.
There we go.
There you are. Hello.
Hey.
Hi. Oh my gosh. I have a comment and a question.
Yes.
Comment being, this was fantastic. And then all your references were just so, they were tangible. They were things that we could practically do. And I find that in this space, especially on this side of the world, everything's theorized. It's talked down. It's, oh, we can't do that. But lo and behold, it's been done. There are so many examples of communities around the world, especially indigenous communities around the world, who are living the utopia that we all dreamed about, where we all literally just spoke about, hearing the birds, the trees, the community. Those are already in existence. And I think because I've traveled, many of us, of course, have traveled and lived in many countries, we know it's possible. So to the people that we're talking about, it feeling a little bit, dejected and hopeless, that's what they want us to feel like. It's the stealing of our hope that enables them to continue in the way that they do. So radical joy, radical happiness in the face of adversity is the reason why the Mandelas of the world can last in jail for 27 years, right? Many of his peers did not make it. It was that hope and that faith that there's a better tomorrow. That was very funny about Martin Luther King's nightmare. Of course, he had many, I'm sure, but he didn't share with that, But my question is, how do we bridge the gap between those who, like us, who've experienced the very fact that the utopia does already exist, in maybe not in the Western world so much. I'm in London, we don't see it, but I know it exists elsewhere. And I reference Paul Rosley's book, Jungle Keepers, and how he describes, the Amazon rainforest, and how that is being threatened. What can we do to help those communities, one, and also get corporations on board in particular who are actually creating the mess? And I just want to reference as well, like, one thing that keeps me going in the face of adversity is that video that I saw of a Palestinian dude who was dancing, doing a shimmy as the bombs were literally raining down on his house. And they were like, this is how we keep ourselves human. Joy, radical hope, radical faith is what keeps us going. So yeah, that's my question and comment.
Beautiful, much appreciated. And Uri.
Yeah, it's sort of relevant to what Andras and Ola said. I feel, and I'm trying to problematize, because that's what I do. I problematize, and I can just say that I do similar dreaming, collective dreaming, and imagining. But I feel there are three blind spots that the question is: have you considered in this practice some of the blind spots? One is living in the imagination as opposed to embodying. The other is the more than human. So again, human imagining the future, but then where are the more than human, the other than human world? And then the future itself as a creation, the linear time kind of frame, which is very kind of Western kind of linear time that is built into this exercise. And again, considering that there are other cultures, other traditions where future is not the same thing or even doesn't exist, and there's more of a circular time or a present moment, right? Like the joy, like the present moment. And how doing this practice, we're not just, again, going with this Horizon 1 basic working recipe of basically how, white folks dominated the world and are still doing it, by creating a world which we're not even living in the present moment. We're living in some kind of fantasy or illusion that is being sold and marketed everywhere.
Beautiful. Thank you. Wow. Great questions. Maybe I'll start with yours first, Yuri. So I think you're right that, there's in terms of time and different time frames, there's a woman called Sherry Turkle who does loads of brilliant work around the impact that smartphones and the internet is having on our attention span and ability to concentrate. She wrote a book where she said, we are forever elsewhere. So actually, a lot of the time, we're not even in the present. We're not even in the future or the past. We're in some weird kind of fantasy, digital nonsense kind of space. And I spoke a little bit before about other. You asked about linear timeframes, and I use a linear time frame when I do that activity just because that's what we're familiar with, and that's the world that we inhabit. But in the book, I talk about a guy called John Mbiti, who was an academic, an African academic who did loads of research into traditional indigenous African understandings of time, and that there were some of those where time ran backwards, and that he talked about how the colonial exercise was one where white Europeans would arrive into somewhere that had already a very sophisticated, extraordinary, different understanding of time, about which those colonizers had zero curiosity at all, and would just put up a tower with a bell on the top that rang every hour, and then restructure everybody's lives around the bell ringing every hour. And there was a whole section that I wrote for the book that it was about indigenous Australian understandings of time, which are extraordinary and sort of massive, deep time ways of thinking, which didn't end up getting into the book, but which you'll find on my website, because I thought, I so enjoyed doing the research and found it so interesting. I was like, I don't want to let this go to waste. So my website is robhopkins.net, and you can find that chapter there. The More Than Human, very much so. And Ruth Bentovim, who I mentioned, who created the Town Anywhere practice, she does a version of Town Anywhere which is about non-human. It's like a mixture of Joanna Macy's Council of All Beings and the Town Anywhere, which she just ran, I think, last week in London, and she runs in various different places. There's also, I would point you to the work of Phoebe Tickell, who some of you I'm sure will have come across, who does amazing work. She calls imagination activism, where she does more work than I do around the more than human, and the role of the non-human, and about living with imagination in a way that's not embodied. I think for me, I try to make this something that is kind of very embodied, and that by the end of doing the workshop that we do, when we do a thing for a day, it's very kind of embodied, and that this is not just a kind of a head thing, and the fact that, like I mentioned before, that it's rooted in the transition movement means that it's very much in that sense of, so what do we do about it? Where can we start now? What's the first steps that we can do? What's the first things? And looking back, so I always tell the story about an amazing project in Liège in Belgium, called the Liège Food Belt, which is one of the most amazing things to come out of transition. We started with 5 people around a table with a question where they said, what if in a generation's time, the majority of food eaten in Liège came from the land closest to Liège? And they are doing the most astonishing work there. They raised 5 million euros of investment from local people. They work with the municipality. They produce 3,500 school meals every day. It's a phenomenal thing, but it started with a visioning thing, with a what if question that they then invited the community to come to discuss together. They thought 100 people would come. 600 people came to that conversation, and then it led to the different things that we see happening there. In terms of radical joy and happiness is a big part of this for me. I love Amitav Ghosh, who was one of the people who started me on this journey, when he talked about climate change is a failure of the imagination. And he wrote something a while ago where he said, what we need now is what he called a vitalist mass movement. He said, which may actually be magical enough to change hearts and minds across the world. And for me, I'm not for a moment saying that what I'm talking about here is the only way to do things, right? We clearly also need people who put their bodies on the line. A friend of mine who was very involved with Just Stop Oil was sentenced yesterday. We need that kind of activism in all the forms that it takes. But I often feel like, we've talked a bit about the civil rights movement in passing today, often in the climate movement, particularly like in things like Extinction Rebellion, the conversation tends to focus on, should we be more like Malcolm X or more like Martin Luther King? That Malcolm X was seen as more radical. So he moved the Overton window that made someone like Martin Luther King seem like the kind of more conciliatory, mainstream, more acceptable voice. So the argument goes, we need things like Just Stop Oil and Insulate Britain and things because they move the window. That's a really important conversation. But what it often forgets is that also in the civil rights movement, you had the Black Panthers who were setting up free school meals, running ambulances in neighborhoods that nobody else would, setting up free schools. And you also had people we now look back and talk about as being Afrofuturists. Octavia Butler, Samuel R. Delaney, Parliament Funkadelic, Sun Ra, people who were who loved the future and science fiction and stories about the future, but who'd grown up watching science fiction stories with no Black people in them, and who then wanted to fill that story with the kind of Black utopian kind of tradition. What I'm saying is I think that we need in these movements, we need some of that as well. We need to make space for the theatricality and the playfulness. You know, when I meet people, you know, when people look back on Extinction Rebellion, and which was phenomenally impactful and did lead to shifts in government policy. And sometimes people say, yeah, actually, that was because loads and loads of people got arrested. That was very much a part of it. But I think also that phenomenal stuff where they took over Waterloo Bridge and turned it into a forest for 8 days and brought the pink boat onto the streets and closed streets to cars and filmed them with kind of party and carnival and celebration. All of that stuff I think was just as important, and we need to do more of that. And so for me, with the Field Recordings from the Future project that we're doing, which there's a website, fieldrecordingsfromthefuture.co.uk, where you can just get a taste of where we've got to so far. But the first show is going to be in Sheffield, 11th, 12th, 13th of November. I do a newsletter called the Time Travelers Gazette, which goes out every month, which is completely free. If you want to subscribe to that, you just go to my website, which is robhopkins.net. Put your email address. Andrea's saying she gets that already and enjoys it, I think. So you just go to robhopkins.net, put your email address in the email newsletter box. You'll get that. So you'll be the first people to hear when the tickets for that show go up. But we're really ambitious about that. We would love that to be as big as those kind of touring Van Gogh, Frida Kahlo light projection things. You know, there should be Field Recordings from the Future time portals opening up all around the world, and we want this. We're writing it in such a way that other people could play the role of me, could play the role of Kit. You know, that's very much what we're doing with that. And then that for me is an event which is unapologetically radically joyful and unapologetically kind of positive about what the future could be. And for me, you know, I in terms of Andras, what you were asking about Horizon 1 and Horizon 2, you know, it's I guess for me, I see the work that I do very much in that kind of new economy, sort of post-growth sort of world. So you know, the stuff that we've been doing in Totnes, with communities becoming their own housing developers, communities becoming their own energy companies, communities building new food systems, new ways of circulating money around, new ways of supporting that new economy to come into being. That, for me, is the bit of where we're trying to help push things across from Horizon 2 into Horizon 3 in that sense. And that maybe one of the best, most skillful ways of doing that is like with the transition movement, that it has always been very much a self-organizing movement of communities around the world trying things out and sharing their stories, and it will look different in different places, and that's why it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of a solution. But when you, like, for years, my role in the transition movement was to scan that movement for stories of what people were doing, and then to share those stories in interesting ways of communities becoming their own energy companies, their own food companies, the stuff they're doing in Liège, where they're building a new food system for that city in a way that is so ambitious and that's already spread to 6 other cities in Belgium. But it's a story that most people never, ever hear. If we can share those stories and celebrate those stories in ways that become really accessible and really mainstream, and, you know, that just form the backdrop of kind of things that people watch in films and stories and whatever like that, you know, this stuff has to become a kind of an infectious kind of a story, I think. And that's the aspect of it that I work on. I suppose, in that sense. I think we're nearly out of time. I could go on for hours and hours. You've all been very patient and stuck around this long. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. We are a couple minutes over. Thank y'all for staying with us. We're just going to wrap up with so much gratitude. Thank you, thank you, thank you, Rob, for being with us today. Thank you for sharing and sprinkling us with so much wisdom. There are so many links that I captured, and I know there's many, many more that we will share. This recording will be available. We'll send it in an email. Jake has also dropped in a bunch of links to how you can participate in the collective imagination practice community. Thank you, thank you, thank you for really just acknowledging the lineage, the deep lineage of collective imagination and dreaming practices, for naming the many Black and Brown women of color who you have learned from. I feel like that is often missing in this conversation. And so it feels really affirming to know that you are lifting those folks up as you continue to learn and move into other spaces and continue to educate, not just about what's happening today, but what has happened and how we got here. So thank you for that. We are going to close our session today. There are going to be a couple more of these conversations. There's curiosity circles, there's an email list. So please make sure you stay in touch with us. And we will see you soon. Thank you so much, Rob. Thank you, Jake. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We'll see you soon.
Beautifully posted. Thank you so much.